button.
This meeting is being
I
recorded.
I did fried chicken. It was the first time I had like or chicken tenders basically. It was the first time I tried doing that, and I just couldn't get it crispy. I couldn't get it like really brown
Did
enough.
you do it in like a pan or did you do it in like a pot?
I put in like a pot of fried oil.
That's okay.
That's what I mean. I just couldn't get it. I couldn't get it to like really crisp
s-
up.
See, I've done for the and yeah, the listeners probably come to this like, what the hell are they talking about? I've done chicken sandwiches, burgers, steaks. I've done veggies. I'm trying to think of all the stuff I cook for them. Like tonight, I did breakfast.
Yeah.
I've made lasagna this week, and there was something else I made. I can't. Oh, French bread pizzas. So I've been trying to like, because all they eat is basically like Hispanic food, and I'm like,
hmm
we got to get you
You're
guys
you're
eating some
trying to assimilate them.
a little bit, and
Try to
like
go all
truthfully,
Dawes Act on them.
well, between you and me, I just finally got sick of just like the same like, you know how like everybody jokes like Taco Bell's just like the same stuff, it's just in different like
Oh
variations.
yeah, it's chicken rice and like beans and
Like
like on some wheat or corn like shell or something. Yeah.
yeah, and that's more or less what they do. Like it's always like some variation, like a chicken dish, or maybe it's like a pork or something like that. And I was like, you guys, we gotta get you guys eating something else. And they're like,
Yeah.
she's my wife is super picky, so I'm always trying to like, okay, will she eat this? Okay, let me try this. Let me try to do something different. And it's just like it's definitely been an adventure, so we say.
Well, it's
And
funny
those,
because Abby, she's got a terrible. She's probably got just as bad of a. I don't want to say diet, but it kind of is. Like she's all, like girl dinner all the time, dude. Like she's like chicken nuggets and snacks and chips and popcorn, like all that kind of stuff. That's all she
well,
eats.
well, to give you an idea how like picky mine is, like so I said I made French toast, eggs, and bacon tonight. So I was plating it all up for them, trying to make it all look pretty and stuff. So I put syrup. I went ahead and put syrup on her French toast, and she was like, "Okay, I'm going to need a different plate for my eggs." I was like, "Why?" And she's like, "Well, because you put syrup on the French toast, I don't want my eggs sitting on the same plate." And I was like, "What
So
the hell? What the hell
there,
is that?"
I am that way, dude. I am that way. I don't like when my eggs have syrup on them.
Well,
Like
it's not
it
like
just it just gets so rich, and I'm just like, ugh, like I can't eat this anymore.
I just thought it was weird because she was like, it wasn't like they were touching. It's just she didn't even want them on the same plate.
Oh well, that's a little weird.
And I was like, all right, that's a little much. It wasn't like I poured syrup on the eggs or something. I was just
Right,
like,
right.
okay, dear, here you plate your own. I gotta go
Yeah.
jump on the podcast. But
That's interesting.
list, the listeners are probably like so fucking confused right now. They're like, what the
Well,
hell is
so let's take this political. Um, I also kind of want to do. I also like doing like one podcast with just Josh, and then like one with just you. So I figured talking about some stuff in Europe, and I know you've got buddies over there and stuff. So I figured this could be kind of in your lane. So tell me a little bit about. I guess just like what is like what the current state of play in Europe politically, and then what is like the long term like direction that they're heading.
I guess the state of play. So the last 2 years, especially since the Ukraine war, like that shook up everything because you had the cost of living crisis where like they shut themselves off from like like you're like Russian gas
Yep.
like that was a
That's the
huge
whole
deal.
Nord Stream 2 thing, right?
Nord Stream 2, it wasn't just Nord Stream like the like
Right,
here
right,
just
right,
recently Ukraine closed off the pipelines that were still going through Ukraine. That was one thing a lot of people didn't know. Like Ukraine still had pipelines from Russia going through it that were still
right.
working up until like recently. So like they were still getting Russian gas, but the reason they were letting that go was because the pre-existing agreement was the Russians had to pay transit rights to the Ukrainians. So it kind of led
Yeah,
to that funny situation where like Europe was still taking Russian gas through Ukraine, and Russia was paying transit fees to Ukraine, who they're at war with. So it was a
well,
very
and I think that's really interesting too because I was reading about that and it was almost kind of making me be like, okay, like Putin isn't just some like bumbling autocratic dictator. Like he knows that hey, if I start cutting off this, if I start severing these gas pipelines that are going through Ukraine into the rest of Europe, that's not a good thing for me, you know? And so like I think for him, he's very been like I think you see this time and again where he's like, "Hey, like I don't want to provoke either. Like I'm very targeted of what I'm trying to do and what I'm here for." And then you don't see him being like, "Okay, like we're going to just Like he didn't. I don't think the Russians were the ones who destroyed Nord Stream 2. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah,
It
I
was
mean, it's
everyone was like, yeah, it's not them. You know, like people were like, this benefits Russia. This is not something that doesn't benefit them.
but
So
yeah, I mean, like the stuff that, as far as the Nord Stream, originally, like, I mean, as soon as it happened, everybody's kind of like, yeah, we definitely did that. I mean, but then they tried pulling like this little stunt for a while. There was like, yeah, it was definitely the Russians that did it. Now,
well, so when you say we did that, do you mean like we did that, the U.S., or do you think it was Ukrainians?
so originally they claimed the Russians did it, and then when
Okay.
they did the official investigation, they never released any findings from it. They're like, ah, you know what, never mind. And then it came out like, oh, there might be a Polish connection. And then it came out, I think it was New York Times last year. They were like, yeah, it was a team of like Ukrainian intelligence on the orders of like
Yeah, it was like
like their
CIA or something, right?
yeah. Now it's kind of, but I mean the the depth of that pipeline and where it was at. I just like they were trying to claim it was like Ukrainian intelligence on like a rented yacht that did it. And it's like, dude,
Yeah.
that was like 3,000 feet deep or something. There's no way a diver could have done that.
No.
And
No.
then,
No.
you know, back at the time, which I remember this, and it's come out since, there was like, yeah, right before it happened, there was like a U.S. like amphibious assault fleet in that area. We call them amphibious assault ships. They're basically like small carriers, more or less.
Yep.
There was like one of them in their area, and it's like, huh, I mean, those ships could definitely do that. And they were right over that area right before it happened. And then I think it was like late last year, there was some stuff come out that like there was a case like right as it was happening, I think it was either like a Danish or like a Swedish Coast Guard ship was like, oh yeah, we're getting reports to the area. We need to go check it out. And then like they encountered her fleet. We basically told them to, like, you know, get lost. So it's kind of like, just saying, more than likely, yeah. Because I
But
mean,
so,
that'd
but so
been you.
what? So, but what does that mean? The state of play is. So, does that mean like the
I mean,
EU is trying to be more independent, or like obviously like the United States wants the EU to be a little bit more independent from Russia, but like what's happening? Because like I guess like that's what I mean is like I always like I don't really quite understand kind of like what Europe's doing. Like a lot of
if it,
times it seems like they're posturing, but it's like they're falling flat on their face economically, and I'm like I don't really know like which way they're kind of going here.
if it makes you feel any better, they don't either. Like that's one
Okay.
thing that like constantly comes up is like there's so much strategic confusion over there because like really, you know, we've dominated that continent like politically since like 45. So it's
So
like, and
also, before you get into that, I just want to say this. So because Josh isn't recording this, we only have 40 minutes. So I don't know how deep we want to get into this, but that's how much time we have.
all
It's
right,
gonna
well,
be a
just
two-parter.
give me like
There's a
a
lot. There's a lot there.
every like 10 minutes, give me like a heads up so I
Okay,
kind of
okay.
know how deep I can get. But like, so especially since 91, after the Soviet bloc collapse and stuff. So like in Europe, there's two main camps, and like I don't like. I mean, I know the EU exists as like an entity, but like it's really kind of one of those things where it's in name only. Like it's
Yeah, and like that's one where it's like no one really kind of knows what it does. It like negotiates on behalf of like at like I think the was it the
like
G7? I think it's like Europe is like one of them, you know, and
it
then you've
basically
got
does like
like all the other
economic
parts.
stuff.
Right. And so like economically it's like one, but then it's like even within that, like and that's what I never quite understood with the EU is it's like there's layers even to the EU. Like, okay, you just use our money, you just use our borders, you know, or you like economically entwined, like you got all that kind of shit. And I never, and that's one thing I was like, when I hear that, and then I hear like, especially with the stuff going on in Ukraine, where it's like all of Eastern Europe is like, for the most part, is like, hey, like we're super like want to be aggressive on this, and then you got some weird states over in Western Europe that are kind of like for it, but like it's just like it seems like there's like all over the place on like where they are and like what their interests and like France was like trying to be a little bit more on the offense of this. I just don't understand any of it. That's why I'm like when once you kind of start really getting into the layers, you're like what the fuck is like this like monstrosity of a system and or of an institution. You know?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, so at like the EU level, so we'll put it like the higher level. There's two main camps.
Yeah.
So there's the Atlanticists, which one that you know, like maintain like a really close relationship with the United States, kind of like, you know, I don't want to say continue to free ride off of us, but there's definitely kind of like a sense where they're like, yeah, we'll just take the U.S. lead on everything. We'll just, you know, that's what we've been doing since, you know, World War II almost. So it's like, yeah, we'll just keep going with that. and then there's more of kind of like a independence. I'm not really sure if independences would be like kind of like a correct word for it, but there's more, I guess, maybe autonomous, where they're kind of like, Europe needs to chart its own course, and that would be like the EU level. That would be the two main camps, and I would definitely say the Atlanticists are still like very predominant, very much kind of like pro America, kind of follow that a lot.
So, but hold
But now,
on. Here's the thing. Who are those Atlantices? So is that like UK, obviously like UK, right? And
mhm.
then it's like who within the EU are that?
So if I had to pick like states, like in particular like
Yes.
nations, I would like, obviously there's, you said the UK, the Scandinavians, you got your Swedens, your Norways, your Denmarks, you got your Baltic nations like, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and then to an extent Germany. Germany's got like a
Germany's
lot of
weird.
weird.
They're like in the
Yeah.
middle.
Yeah, I mean, like the main parties. Well, you really can't call them main parties now because the AFD's kind of coming up there. But I mean, as far as like the traditional main parties, like the SD,
What's
no,
it? CDA
SDP,
and all that? All the Christian
yeah,
Democrats?
CDU, the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, the Green Party, which is,
Yep.
I want to get in the Green Party, but like that's a funny story we'll have to talk about sometime. That's a really deep rabbit hole if you ever want to go
Yeah.
down that one. But so I mean, Germany kind of to an extent, and then you got your more autonomous, which I would say France, Italy to an extent, and
The Baltics, right?
or the Balkans, yeah. So like,
Balkans.
but now they're kind of reaching the point where I'm not even sure if they're autonomous because they're kind of charting their own thing. Like this has been one of the big things since the Ukraine war kicked off. Is like, first it was Hungary kind of by itself, and now you've had like right wing populist parties kind of win
It's like
Slovakia.
Romania.
Yeah,
Romania was
well,
one, right?
yeah, well, see, that was the other big thing. So like the guy that was like really pro Russia won the first round of the elections, and they annulled those elections.
Yep.
So that's been a big thing the last like month or so because it's like we had this election, you guys threw out the results, and now they're
Yeah,
trying
it's
to
not
get
very
like,
democratic of you, right?
yeah, and that's like been a big thing over there. Like I've known a lot of Romanians that are just like, yeah, I mean, for lack of a better term, they're like, screw this democracy stuff. If you're just going to throw out our election results, how is this different from the communist era? So
Well,
it's
so
like,
I've heard that stuff's happening too, and I've heard that like those countries are just like I don't know, it's like culturally they're kind of more Eastern than they are Western,
yeah, they're not as
all
they're
that kind of
nowhere near
stuff.
as liberal, yeah,
No, and like
and
Poland was like the most Western Eastern country, and then some of the Baltic states as well. But it's very
yeah.
much kind of like a North, and I think I've heard this where it's like Northern Europe is completely different than Southern Europe.
Oh yeah, they're all like, you got to think about like the different political cultures, histories,
Yep.
and stuff like that. So I mean, there's huge differences. But like, so originally when the Ukraine war kicked off, it was basically just Hungary by itself, and then obviously Serbia, but Serbia's not in the EU, but it's very like a pro-Russia kind of.
Yep.
And now, like, I mean, Hungary is very, very interesting. Like, they are following a very pragmatic. Like, they're not leaning too hard one way. Like, yeah, like they have like a very pro. Like, recently they just had the presidency of the EU, which is kind of like a 1 year rotating basis. Like, one country gets it for a year, then it rotates to somebody else. So they just had it for years. Like they were pushing for like a like some sort of peace deal in Ukraine, which like the rest of the EU was like, what, no, we don't want to do this. But Hungary pushes for that. They have relations. They have really good relations with China.
Yeah.
And then they signed a deal. I think it was last year to get what do you call it? BYD. It's like China's big EV car maker now.
Hmm.
So I mean, like, and then but at the same time, they're still in NATO. They're still doing all this. They're still keeping relations with the West. And then they've also like Turkey been in the news a lot. Like, Hungary has really good relations with Turkey. So I mean, they're really it. I'm not sure if autonomous in the EU sense is correct, but I think definitely in like a general sense, like Hungary really pushes for that. And now, like I said, like they've had like-minded people elected in Slovakia. There looks like there's going to be some elected in Austria if they don't annul those elections. There was almost one in Romania. So I mean, like that whole region is kind of starting to pull its own, kind of trying to, I guess, balance, not lean too much one way or the other. So I mean that's and then kind of taking that in general is what makes it so difficult to be like, uh, what was I going with that? Like kind of in the sense of like they're trying. There's just so many different factions within the EU. It's hard to put what is the EU like going to do as far
So
as like where they're heading.
so before we get into the economic part of all this, because I've heard like economically Europe is just tanking,
Yeah.
and they've been stagnant pretty much since like 2011, since I think the Eurozone or whatever it was. But before we get into that, I want to ask: is the EU? and I thought about this, is the EU separate from NATO? I mean, I know they technically are, but it's like at this point, like other than like Austria, it's like everyone's kind of in this militarily. And even Austria, I would say if war did break out in Europe, they would be siding with one side than the other. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so
Yeah.
like I almost kind of wonder like institutionally, do you think these are two institutions or do you think they are fundamentally one?
Fundamentally, one in the sense that like even NATO's pretty like they're both organizations have been pretty open about like okay, usually if you're a member of one, you're going to be a member of the other. So it's kind
Right.
of like and like there
But it's like
was
why don't
back.
you just join them at that point?
I think because the EU like it's the whole ostensible purpose of the EU is like eventually it wants to make like a federal Europe. So instead of just having
Right.
it be an organization, it's like an actual nation in of itself. So I think while NATO includes like Canada and us, so it's not like we want to be a part of that, but it's like and two, like NATO's been pretty open about like, hey, usually we go in first because after the Soviet bloc collapsed, NATO was in there first. Then after those countries joined NATO, then they joined the EU. So it's kind of
It's almost like you
and
pacify them like through NATO and then you kind of feed them economically.
basically, and funnily enough, there has been various talk of that or stuff along those lines.
But it's
But
interesting though because like Eastern European countries have obviously grown. I mean, look at Poland since the Soviet era. But it's like and maybe we can tie this into the economic part. But so Poland is, like economically they're done much better since the fall. But they're nowhere near some of Western Europe and even Western Europe to the United States. Like I think that's one thing we kind of think about is like, oh, somewhere in like Poland or places in France or I think it's so the big hallmark is the United Kingdom. If it was like the 51st state, it would have the lowest like GDP per capita or whatever it is in the United
mhm.
States. And it's like okay, and then Poland's less than that. And it's like okay, Mississippi is better than the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is better than Poland, it's like, okay, like we're talking like two steps removed. And you see some of his growth, but it's like, yeah, not all of Eastern Europe has gotten this growth. Like down in the Balkans, I don't know if they've seen huge economic gains. Now they're kind of newer to it, but I feel like you haven't seen that. And I feel like this conservative backlash is to that.
Well, I mean, one funny thing I'll throw out there real fast, because we got flexed on the British just a little bit. Poland's about to overtake Britain in GDP and GDP per capita.
That's something that's so interesting is it's like I am surprised the UK is having these issues.
It
Because
is
like
horrendously bad.
I guess I'm just like baffled because it's like I don't care about UK politics, but it's like or I shouldn't say I don't care, but not as much. But it's like like you still want like I find it interesting that basically England has given up its imperial power and now they're like a meh on the world stage economically. And I'm like, you can't tell me that all of Britain has been economically dominant because of its empire. I feel like it's because of a lot of that cultural and innovation and stuff like that. And so it's like weird to see that that's not really kind of happening anymore in that country. And maybe because they all just come over here to the United States, which is definitely true.
A lot of it's. I'm trying to think how I can phrase it, because like the whole thing with the UK, like their political culture is like extremely bankrupt, and like I'm pretty good friends with some commentators over there. I've got a friend that's like an economist that lives over there, and he's just like, I'm just looking at all of this, and it's just like they're on track to be a lot poorer than Poland if this keeps up. Like it's
Yeah.
just there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, insofar like I do agree with you, it wasn't just the empire. Like that doesn't explain it. Like
I mean, they
Britain's
were they were dominant. I mean, you could say like early in like I mean, England was basically before 1945 to probably like what? I mean, the 16, 15, maybe even 1400s, England was one of the preeminent world powers. And it's like, okay, so that was way before you really had an empire. And it's like, so like what happened? Like you were dominant. I mean, you were bankrolling countries during Napoleon's wars, and it's like you then had your empire and it's like I'm surprised that it's like you're just not you're having these issues like what's going on here? Like I just don't understand that. I don't understand what happened.
I mean, it was recently as like the 2000s. They weren't doing bad. Like the one that, like, London was like considered the second city of finance, so it wasn't like it
Yeah.
was that long ago. But it's just like really the last few years, and I mean, I can throw out various ideas of why it's gotten so bad recently, but
Well, go
like
ahead.
there's definitely been like a downward trajectory for longer than those times. So I mean, it's
Well,
so
so what do you think are some of the reasons then?
like I said, like institutionally, Britain has really declined. I think that's a big one. I do think there is, and then two, like their fertility rates collapsed back in the '70s. So I mean, it's
So
like
so let me ask you this: how much of it is also immigration?
it could be a fair amount. Like
Yeah.
I'm not familiar enough with their statistics to comment on it, but I can say based off what I've seen in other nations, like
Hmm.
that's excuse me. But it's like I said, like their fertility rates collapsed in the '70s. They've and like especially the last few years where like Europe itself has just cut itself off from like Russian gas. I mean that's the cheapest option available. So it's like I think pre-war Britain was getting like 10 to 15% of their gas from like Russia. I could be wrong on that, but I'm thinking that was about the ballpark of it. And it's like that hurts. But then I'm also like Poland was getting like I think it was like 90% of their gas. So it's like why is still Poland's still doing better than the UK? And it's just like I it's really I mean it's one of those situations where it's like I honestly just have to think their institutions and political culture have just decayed to the point they're not. And I mean there's also like the general point of like you said a lot of them come over here as far as the UK. I think that's very accurate ways. Like I don't think you're thinking. I'm sure you're thinking like talent, but like after especially after World War II, where Britain basically just became this declining, it very rapidly lost its superpower status, and then the United States became so dominant. More or less their political class just kind of merged into our political class. And it's like, they went from being an imperial center to more of an imperial periphery. So I think that could have something to do with it. I mean, if most of your, you know, innovation and stuff like that's kind of going across the pond, I mean, that definitely hurts too. I mean,
So I mean,
it's just,
I've always thought, and maybe this is kind of my view of Europe in general, is I feel like yeah, I feel like us in Europe need to be in lockstep with how we handle economics, how we handle wars, how we handle everything. Like I feel like we gotta be like in lockstep, and I do think, and some people may not like it. I think the United States should take the leading role in that. But I think there is a case for like Europe needs to be the ones dealing with their own shit. And I think, this kind of Russian and Putin thing, and then, you kind of see this with the economics and you see this with, some of the immigrations. Like I think Europe needs to kind of like needs to learn to kind of stand up for on its own two legs a little bit. And I think if they get to the point where they have to make those hard decisions, I think they're going to make the correct decision, and that's going to be a better and stronger the Europe. But I feel like it's the same thing as you see in UK, you'll see it in France. You could copy and paste it to every other country in Europe. What's happening in the UK is happening everywhere else.
well, then too, like, the other big thing with that is like, so I mean, it, let me just stumble over my words for no reason. Now, when you say Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet, do you mean as a singular entity or as a collective entity? Because
So
that's
I think as a collective entity, but here's the thing, I, you know, I really don't care if Europe is more decentralized or centralized. I really do not care as long as they work effectively and they're working, like I said, in lockstep with us. And, you know, and so when I say they need to stand on their own 2 feet, I think, I guess generally, yeah, like I think they need to kind of consolidate on some of these issues. And I think that, kind of get back on the same page. But I really don't care how they
so.
do it.
The reason I bring that up is because that's been a very serious question in American strategic thinking going back at least as far as the early '90s. Probably a lot earlier, honestly, if you think about it in a general sense. So, like, there's these classified documents from like I think from 1993, where Washington's like, this European Union thing, it could be a good thing. It keeps Europe from fighting wars amongst itself. We don't have to worry about like another, Germany invades Poland or something like that. But it's also
Yep.
like if Europe unites, this kind of Europe has a lot more population than we do. Back then, their collective GDP was a lot higher than ours. Their collective GDP was higher than ours, I think, until like 2009. So it's like, do you really want a Europe of like 400 or 500 million people? I think it's about 500 million with like a GDP higher than ours. Because if that happens, they're going to start. If they're a singular entity, they can. If they start sitting on their own 2 feet, that means we're going to lose a lot of our influence there. And that was a big concern for Washington because it's like, even today, if you go look at it, as much as Europe's declined, they still, I think, produce like 40% more vehicles, like 30% more steel. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but something like that. So it's like if they did unite today, they as bad as they've got now, they'd still be a behemoth compared to even us, like certain sectors. So it's like that's been
Yeah,
a
but
big thing.
you have to. I think the big thing is that while I think they do have the steel and aluminum, I think a lot of that is also just trade and domestic policy. You talk about the cars and everything like that. I think one of the big things that I remember Joe Manchin said, I think it was to Macron, was Macron was like, "Hey, you need to change these, taxes or these tariff numbers or whatever it is on vehicles coming from Europe to the United States." And he was like, "What's the rate that like we put on them?" And it was like 2.5%. And he's like, "What's the rate that you all put on us?" And it was like 10%. And he's like, "I think we're gonna do just fine." Or like I think you guys will be fine like figuring it out. Like I think a lot of that is like a trade policy. And if we did a fair trade policy where it was mutual, I think 100%, um I think we would produce more vehicles and more steel and all this other kind of stuff than them.
Well, let me let
Um,
me let me let me
Good.
put it like this though, because it's like, yeah, I mean, if you put it in like taking that argument at face value, why would they have any incentive to agree to that? Because if that means we're producing more cars than steel here, that puts their jobs at risk. So that's kind of the catch 22 that U.S.
I think it's
We
like a surplus kind of a thing. Or not
well,
surplus, a subsidy where it's like, hey, we're letting you do that and we're letting you be the ones to supply and produce that
mhm,
because it's almost kind of like, hey, we'd rather have it. I mean, we'd rather
yeah.
have aluminum plants and stuff like that in Australia and Japan and US and maybe Brazil. Like you want to spread out your stuff all over the place. And I think a lot of it, yeah, it makes sense just to put it in Europe. Um, to just kind of have like that marketplace there, so you can kind of do some domestic stuff.
And that
Um,
makes that does make sense in like a globalized system, but I think if you look into most think tanks and you talk to most people now, they kind of agree like, yeah, this post 1991 globalism that's kind of on the way out because now we're facing a situation where it's trade and like the globe is starting to kind of
but
divide
so
into two camps almost. So it's
oh,
like, I mean, I get what you're saying. Like, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm just saying like you've kind of reached a situation where it is a catch 22 because you know, yeah, Europe gets to do all that, but traditionally up until really the last year or two, their market for a lot of that surplus they made was like places like China and Russia. So now that like we're kind of at loggerheads with them, they really can't do it. And it's like before the war, I think it was like Volkswagen and BMW controlled like I think it was like 50% of the Russian market in vehicles, and now it's
probably.
like two. It's like 1 or 2%. Like Chinese brands have like displaced them, and it's like. And that's a big thing that's come out now is like a lot of these German car makers are like, guys, like we've lost one of our largest markets, and then you've cut us off from like cheap Russian, gas and oil. So now we're like our overhead is through the roof, and like that's been a big thing. Like they've been saying in private is like they're really upset about that. So I mean, like I agree, like in a fair system, this and like I agree that's probably the ideal way to go. And that's one thing we've talked before about the Bancor or something like that. Like I agree that's the way we should go with stuff, but like there is the human element to this where it's like I don't want to say it's a zero sum game, but there is kind of an element to that. And it's like, it's either we have to accept that, the Chinese will have more influence in Europe than we would like, or it's like we can cut out the Chinese, but then, that's going to really kind of drag Europe down. And if you give them more autonomy, I mean, their own sense of self preservation is probably going to make them use that autonomy in ways we don't want them to use that autonomy. And I mean, this is something that, like, especially it was a lot more prominent back in the '90s and the in like the 2000s when like everybody was trying to figure out, okay, what does this new EU thing mean? And then all of a sudden, China's exploding. It's becoming this big economy, and then Russia revives, and it's like, okay, guys, what does this mean? And it's kind of become a lesser concern in the last decade or so, but that's just because Europe has declined so much. So I mean, and their decline has kind of made them more dependent on us in ways. So I mean,
So I've got 7 minutes and 45 seconds left. We can go back and do another one right after this, and do like a part one, part two if you want to.
okay,
But because like I said, we're not doing anything else tonight. As much as I hate to say it. But
we've
I
reached
guess
that point in our 20s.
I know, but I think about what I think you said something that's really important, and that's China's influence on this, and especially its stranglehold economically. And I think that's really kind of the question that I think, I'd really like to see kind of what Donald Trump does, because I think Joe Biden did some good stuff, and I think Donald Trump, session one did some good stuff with how are you going to handle trade with China. And for me, I think Donald Trump did some good stuff. I think Biden did some good stuff, and I think it's gonna when Trump comes back, how much more is he gonna do? And I think, just I think because I believe that if you did the corporate, you stop this like, hey, we're gonna own, this uh nation corporation kind of deal that they got in their country. I feel like if you kind of start cutting these ties and really kind of letting the free market happen, I could totally see it, Europe coming in a better situation because now, these subsidies aren't going into China and all this other kind of stuff. But it almost just seems like that's going to be the next big question is that for Europe, it's like, okay, you're going to have to pull some from China. So what are you going to pull? And how can the United States and Europe kind of handle how are we going to deal with this China situation and trade? And I think even if you get, dude, honestly, like I think about this sometimes, I'm like, let's say you get 15% out of China. 5% goes to Europe, 5% goes to the United States, 5% goes to nearshore. Like that's like that like you talk about like the number of jobs that would actually be in the United States and Europe and stuff like that, it would I think would really kind of change a lot of what's happening. Like I said this about Joe Biden is I think he's going to be remembered as probably doing a pretty decent job of manufacture of having jobs and stuff because I think a lot of that stuff's coming over. And I think once we're starting to see how much we're getting back, I think like economically, I hope that the United States and Europe can kind of be bumped up a little bit more. And like I said, even if they get 5% of that, that's probably hundreds of thousands. I think it would really kind of ramp up what needs to happen in Europe to keep them afloat. And so for me, what I'm curious about with Donald Trump's administration is like, okay, how are you going to team up with Europe to do this? Because the first time you just fucked around and you didn't really do anything, and like you never worked with your allies to get this done. When the United States and Europe could both benefit from this. So like, what do you think is going to be Trump's impact on where Europe is going to land? Or where they're going to land compared to where they want to land.
If you want me to be brutally honest, I really don't think he's going to give just laying it out there. Like I really don't think he's going to give a fuck about Europe. And the reason I'm saying that is because like I don't know if you saw this. I think I sent it to our group chat, but like he invited G to come to his inauguration. And then
Hmm.
she was kind of like, I don't really want to do that. So now they're sending like one of the Chinese vice presidents. They have
Yep.
multiple vice presidents, but it came out like the Trump's team was really trying to get him to send I think his name is like Cal something. Chow. I can't. Fuck if I know how to pronounce his
Yep.
name. But that was like G's number two. So like it's like the people I've talked to in economics are like, yeah, this is pretty indicative that he wants to do some sort of deal with the Chinese. And the fact that Trump's also doing this stuff with like Greenland and stuff right now, I really don't think he cares too much about Europe. I think he's kind of come to the
So you think
conclusion
he's
like,
going to be a little bit more adversarial towards Europe, and I don't want to say conciliatory, but a little bit try to get a deal with China.
yeah, 100%. Like he's given
But
all
see,
the
but it's
signals for
for
that.
me, like maybe this is where the Democrats and conservatives kind of, the conservatives and or maybe I should say the Democrats and the Republicans, maybe not the conservatives, whatnot. But from the Democrats and the Republicans, I feel like this is maybe one place, foreign policy wise, that there could be this gap in the next 2 years is where Democrats are like, hey, we shouldn't abandon Europe. And Trump is thinking, hey, we got to start pivoting more towards Asia with Russia, North
Yeah,
Korea, and those kind of
and
places.
my boy Elbridge Colby, I think I sent you that where they did confirm he was getting like an
Did he
undersecretary.
confirm? Okay, I saw he was what? It was like deputy secretary of like policy or something for like
Something like
defense policy or whatever it is, you know.
so. Basically, he's not the number two guy, but he's like the number two guy for that sector of it, which kind of makes
Hmm.
sense because he was the dude that wrote the 2018 national security strategy. So I mean, like that's my boy right there. I'm very proud of him. But his big thing is like, yeah, we want to. He's not. I don't want to. I don't think he's not confrontationalist, but he's kind of in the sense he's like, I think we should. He's very big on like we need to pivot to Asia. We need to pivot to Asia. Like this Ukraine war, it really doesn't matter to us. If Europe thinks it's that big of a deal, they can deal with it themselves. And his big thing is like we need to pivot to Asia. We need to like establish like really firm alliances with like Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan. And he's like we don't need to try to like get aggressive with China, but it's more like I guess almost kind of like a revival of like Cold War containment strategy, but not an aggressive version. He's very much in this. His big thing is like, I think no matter what we do, China's going to be big this century. So like, we need to give them their place in the sun, so to speak. But he's like, we don't need to let them go like crazy in the Pacific. But it's like contain them to where they're not like aggressively expanding everywhere, but at the same time they don't feel like we're putting them in the same position we put Japan in 1941. So he's like, do enough to where you kind of keep them contained, but kind of not so much they feel like they have to lash out. And like, as part of that, he's very much like I said, like let Europe deal with its own problems. If Ukraine's that big to them, let them step up to the plate and handle it. So I mean, that's the type of people he's appointing. Trump and Vance both have been very open about like there needs to be some sort of deal in Ukraine. And then too, like I said, like the Greenland stuff, like it really to me was kind of a sign that he's like, I really don't care. Like I'm focused, I'm focused more on like American concerns. Like let's focus on that. And then too, like I said, like going back to Europe in particular, like there's so many divergent thoughts in Europe right now about where they need to go. They're not, you start off asking where Europe's going, and like they're not in a good position at all. Like economically, they're declining by all metrics.
All
Germany's
right.
industrial.
So I was gonna say,
Good.
let's leave it there and let's do a part two.
All right, sounds good.
All right. See you.
This meeting is being
So
recorded.
we're doing part two now. I'll probably end up doing, honestly, dude, I'll probably end up doing this as like a part one video and then a part two video, just to milk the views. But we'll see. Um, so one of to kind of where you ended is kind of basically the strategy of pivoting towards Asia. Which honestly, dude, I think when I was hearing, I think I heard that like even Obama was like, "Hey, we got to start pivot." Like that's when they really kind of started laying this groundwork. Like we got to start looking at what's going on in China. And I think it was like 2014, 15, and 16 is when they're like, "Hey, like that's something we got to do." So I think that policy was there, but what I think is just kind of weird to me is it's like, okay, like this is something we've kind of known and have thought about for a while, and Europe kind of needs to do their own thing. Like we're moving away from this. Um, but one of the things you didn't say was Russia. So like when they looked at this pivoting from Europe to Asia, what did they expect Russia to do in response to that pivot? Do you think, or I mean, was it almost like, hey, we're going to do this, and then we don't expect Russia to invade or be aggressive? Because the signs were there. So that's why I'm kind of like, so what did they expect or not expect to happen?
Honestly,
Because that
so
doesn't
you
make
are,
sense to me, right?
and to be fair, it didn't really make sense to a lot of people. Like that's something that's come up a lot. Is like, we. I think a lot of it was there was a sense of hubris to a certain extent, but there was also kind of a sense of like maybe we can work with like people. A lot of people forget during the first little bit of the Obama years, there was definitely kind of a I don't know if rapprochement is the right term, but maybe like a detente in the sense that like that like we had fairly I wouldn't say good, but fairly decent relations with them. It wasn't like the Georgia Award really back in 2008 derailed stuff that much. It was And there is the kind of that famous. It was kind of a big political scandal, kind of in a way, back in like 2011, I think it was, where Obama was caught on like a hot mic telling, like, I think it was wasn't Putin, I think it was Medvedev. Yeah, I could be more flexible after I get reelected or stuff, as far as like cutting deals and stuff. So I think there was kind of a mixture of like hubris, but also an expectation that maybe the Russians, could be, we could cut a deal with them or something like that.
Oh, I
And
believe
then,
we could. I believe we can.
oh yeah,
I think it's, but it's like the question is like, well, what kind? Just like when we talk about the budget and deficit and everything like that. It's like, so what kind of deal are you willing to make?
and
You
that
know,
was, yeah.
and I think, and that's the thing that I just don't quite understand. And this is where I really wish I was a fly on the wall in those rooms where I feel like the United States was like, it would be like, hey, if Russia was more democratic and a little bit more civil and a little bit willing to be a little bit more cooperative, if they're wanting to be in the EU, they could get that. If they're wanting to be in NATO, they could get that. But it's like, okay, I want to know the reason why we're not willing to try to do some of these baby steps. And maybe it's because we did and shit happened, but it's like I feel like there's some things we can do to really kind of try to mend this relationship because I think, what was it before uh Soviet Russia? I mean, Russia was like an ally of the United States and had deep history. And so that's why I'm kind of like, okay, like why like this I feel like this is something we can fix more so than our relationship with China, where I feel like that's a little bit more different. Russia's at least a little bit more European and a little bit more Western, and I feel like you can do business with them. So
So,
I get why Obama's like, hey, that's something we can try to do.
and as insofar as like, yeah, he was trying to do a pivot to the Pacific for China. So like that was kind of the idea. And then, I mean, I don't think it was what happened back in 2013, 2014. It's one of those things where like I feel like we want to know a lot more in 20 years. I think right now. So
With
like
Crimea or with Obama?
Crimea with like everything, because like that's when Ukraine kicked off. That's when there was the Syrian civil war. That's when the Russians really intervened in that. Um,
So what are you
so I
not
think,
buying? What are you not buying with that? Maybe the second segment can be like all Russia and kind of where Ukraine kind of ties into this. So what are you saying is missing?
well, I think that was kind of maybe not necessarily missing, but I think that was kind of the final straw. And you brought up the point of like, like Russia and NATO, Russia and the EU. They actually did try to do that back in the 90s. Like Boris Yeltsin was very interested in joining at least NATO, and the
Right,
Clinton
but
administration.
he needed to get a little bit further into reasonableness for that to happen.
Well, to put it in perspective, Yeltsin literally had American consultants come over and run his reelection campaign back in the 90s. So I mean, it
Right,
wasn't.
but I don't think that yeah, I don't think Boris Yeltsin was like, "Hey, like like Poland was accepted in 99. I don't think when Boris Yeltsin took over in 91, 93, whichever year it was, I don't think he was like, "Hey, we can get to being standing on our own democracy and willing to get into NATO." Like, I don't think that was going to happen in that amount of time. I think if Russia really wanted to put in the work, I think they could have done it in like 2010. But, I don't know about, you know,
We'll
down
see.
the nights. I think it's a little unreasonable.
Well, not okay. Let's say like full membership, yeah, that amount of time, sure, but like we weren't even willing to grant them like observer status. That was like a big thing. That was a big issue with like the Clinton administration back in the 90s. Was like, do we even give them the first steps? And they wouldn't. And like this was a big thing. Like,
Well, and that's one that I don't agree with because I'm like, like you're not showing them the war plans. You know what I mean? Like you're
mm,
just allowing them to be an observer to meetings and whatnot. Like for me, like at that time, I would have said like, okay, like that's a step we could take. Not now, but like at the time, like yeah, I feel like that's reasonable. That's one of those things where I'm like, I don't understand why they didn't do that.
and that was a big thing back in like. There's a ton of articles from the New York Times I can send you from like the late 90s where like they had all the old Cold Warriors, the guys that basically formed U.S. policy during the Cold War, were like, hey guys, they're making a genuine effort to kind of at least come to some sort of agreement with us on like Eastern Europe. like maybe we shouldn't let Poland in NATO because that's obviously going to be a provocative step while we're not letting them in NATO. Like the Russians were kind of taking the position of like, when we ended when the Eastern Bloc fell apart, the agreement, they had struck a gentleman's agreement, and that James Baker, who was, I think, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet
So
Union
so
at the time.
I was watching a video about this today, and I heard that even that was kind of like misconstrued with how it was delivered and everything like that.
So that was there is enough evidence. I feel like that's kind of cope in a sense because James Baker himself later came out and was like, yeah, like we did kind of make they didn't write it on paper, but it was kind of like, and there was declassified U.S. documents, I think from '92 or '93, that was like, yeah, we had in private told Gorbachev like we wouldn't expand NATO, and
So
Gorbachev
so
was
I go ahead and finish.
so just kind of put this in perspective real fast. So like we'd agreed like, okay, we won't expand NATO past like Germany. So that was kind
Mhm.
of, and then when we decided we were going to do that, the Russians were like, the '90s they weren't really in the position to oppose that, but their kind of stance they took was like, okay, if you're going to expand NATO anyway, then how about you let us join NATO? And then when we're like not even letting them take the first steps on that, it kind of puts Moscow in the position of like, huh. So they're aggressively expanding NATO to our frontier, but they're not letting us join. How do you think that makes us look at this? That kind of comes off a certain way to us, and like that, and like who was the guy that wrote the long telegram back in '47? He's I can't think of his name. He's generally considered the father of like the containment strategy. Keen was it? Does it? Let me look that up real fast. I cannot think that guy's name. He's really famous for like in the Cold
Was he like a
War.
Secretary of State?
No, he was like I think he was somebody in the State Department, but George Keenan. So he
Oh,
wasn't the Secretary of State, but he was considered like one of the
yeah.
foremost policy guys. He wrote like a really good op-ed in the New York Times. I think back in '98 was like because he was still alive at that point. He was like, "Hey, I'm the guy that literally wrote the policy that kind of contained the Soviets during the Cold War."
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here telling you right now, like what you're doing, that's just going to create a conflict down the road because they're not going to take that well. Like there's factions and right now the people in power in Moscow are willing to cut a deal with us, but if like we do all of what they're wanting to do right now, that's not going to last. He's like, we need to think this through, and like ended up. I mean, he was spot on. I mean, he called it. He was like, if we do this, they're going to respond very negatively to that, and then that's just going to lay the seeds for future conflict. And now look where we're at. So I mean, like, ideally, either we should have kept to the informal promise, limited NATO to Germany, and then kind of like kept like the rest of Eastern Europe as like a buffer, or we should have like let the Russians gradually come in. And I don't think. I mean, just being brutally honest, like the whole like they need to be a democracy to get in or something like that. Like if you go look up some of those countries we let in the Balkans,
Oh, I'm not, and that's the thing. I'm not saying they need to be. I've never said they need to be a democracy,
I
but
know.
it's like, hey, like, can you be like Poland? Like not like amazing, but like not great either. Like that. And that's what I'm saying. Like when you start going like two or three steps down, and you're realizing, oh, like these countries are like wealthy, but they're not like the United States.
Yeah, and
They're
that's kind.
not like the United Kingdom or France like that we go on vacation at and we think, oh, these places aren't too bad, but it's like, no, they're one step below that. They're like the rural countryside in like Spain or something like that. There's not a lot of money.
Mhm.
I
But
actually
it's
think I don't think it was NATO encroachment. I think probably one of the bigger components is probably the NATO involvement in the Yugoslav wars. I think that was probably a bigger push than the NATO expansion.
I would say it was a symptom of the wider expansion because like one of the things that's come out now is like we're like this is a really crazy one to me. So Orban was he's prime minister now, but he was also prime minister for a stint back in like the '90s,
Mm.
and like he's come out now. There's been like some I think some declassified documents in our end come out to prove it. Like we were pushing Hungary to like invade Serbia back in the Yugoslav wars. So I mean, like
Oh,
we
I'm
were.
not
I mean,
surprised.
yeah, and I agree with you. Like that was a very big issue. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but have
Well,
you heard about the Pristina airport incident?
I don't think I've, dude, that's the thing is like I've never really kind of looked into this, um, these wars, but from what I've read is it was like this was kind of like a big deal because it was also like a reshuffling of power in the Balkans.
Yeah.
in Balkans all the way, all the way over to Romania and like all those kind of places. And so I think a lot of it was, yeah, like, this was old Russian territory. You've got the whole Serbia thing with the Slavs. And I think this was honestly more important than that was, like the NATO expansion. Just because it's like, hey, like we definitely have a say here and we're being kept out of like what this future in this place looks like. Now, the alternative was is that I think Russia wanted to have a sphere of influence in the Balkans, and NATO basically was like, no, like that's not happening. Um, but I don't know. I mean, and that's the thing is, it's like I wish I could talk to Putin and be like, dude, what the fuck is going on here, man? Like, I know you probably did some shit. Well, we know you did some shit, but it's like, there's probably a reason for it. So like what's going on? Like what really was it that really pissed you off? Or did you just were always pissed off? You know what
And
I mean?
it's in terms of like why he invaded Ukraine or like the
Why
general
he
like
invaded
antagonism.
Ukraine? Where did this all start? Like all that kind of stuff. Like what was it, Yugoslav or was it NATO expansion? Like which one really was it? Or was it like, hey, these three things happened at the same time and we were kind of like fuck them and they were like fuck you and we're like okay, like now we're not friendly anymore? Because like you said, like pretty much through most of Bush's administration, like Russia and the US actually had pretty good relationships.
Oh yeah.
I think Putin, like I was watching some of the videos where it's like Putin's over here like hanging out with Bush on his farm and shit like that, and it's like coming over here and visiting in the United States. And I'm like, what the fuck? I
And
was
that
like, this is
reminds me
crazy. Go ahead.
Bush even said in private Putin was interested in NATO, like joining NATO even in the early 2000s.
I think
And like
I I think what stopped it was just like they just are too corrupt right now. Like I don't think they had their shit like ready to go to try to like make that work.
well, that would make that could be part of it, but there's also like I mean, if you're talking about corruption again, like a lot of those Eastern European nations we let in, very corrupt. But I mean,
But I'd
I
say
know there's
but I would say every single one of them had made progress.
oh yeah, I mean, and
I don't know if I'd say Russia would be the average of that group or be the leader of that group or be at the very end of the group, you
I
know?
think it's if I remember right, it's towards the end of the group. It's still broadly comparable to European, like Eastern European norms, but I think it's about the same as like I think the like Croatia and Slovenia. It's like another like old Yugoslav places or whatever. But
Yeah, let's
but
see.
like another big issue. I mean, yeah, I mean I would agree. Like the Russians to like a big thing was like, hey, this is part of our sphere. You're moving into it. You're doing this and that. And like I mentioned it. I don't know if you heard me sing. Are you familiar with the Pristina Airport incident?
Well, that's what you're just saying. No, I don't think I'm familiar with that.
So back during the Yugoslav wars, we were trying to capture the Pristina airport, which is in Kosovo, or I don't want the Serbs to come after me. So it's in the region referred to as Kosovo. Uh, so there's this huge airport. There's Russian peacekeepers in the region. We're in the region. The Russians beat us to capture this really critical airport. So there's a Russian force sitting on the airport. And Wesley Clark, who's the U.S. general, is trying to. At one point, he literally asked or I think he actually issued direct orders to like a British, I think it was a British like airborne division, and was like, "Yeah, we're going to attack the airport. We're going to attack those Russians there." And the British commander refused the orders and was like, "I'm not starting World War III for you."
Yeah.
So I mean, like that was a pretty big incident because it's like, for one, we're carving out Kosovo from Serbia, but it's also like we nearly came to blows with like Russian forces, like direct NATO versus Russia combat. So I mean, I mean, and don't get me wrong, like the Russians are not innocent. Like it's like you said, they do want their own sphere of influence. But now, I don't think I'm very much a pragmatist as far as like geopolitics. I think any reasonably powerful country is going to have interest. And it's going to have like we don't like to refer to it as this, but I'm like we consider the Americas our sphere of influence. If not the whole Americas, then at least Mexico and Canada.
Yep.
I don't think that's unreasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable if like Russia's like, hey, you know, these regions are, they're very close to our borders. They're historically been a part of our nation. Like, this is our spirit of influence. I don't think that in of itself is necessarily, you know, evil or bad. I think that's just how power works. And I think that's true for any nation, like I'm not saying the Chinese have a right to take Taiwan, but I kind of, at least on an objective level, I can be like, okay, the Chinese think this is their sphere of influence, so I can kind of see where their thought process. Like, not
Well,
saying it's
so
right, I'm just saying I
one,
get it.
I actually, when I was doing my PhD, one of the guys who I taught with, he was from China, and I fucking love him. I always thought he was a Chinese spy because it was right around the time I was getting into politics, and
Mhm.
I was like, oh my God, they're fucking recruiting me. Like they're planting something on me, and like I'm gonna get $100,000, where the Russia was like trying to influence podcasters or something like that. Like some
Mhm.
Chinese people are gonna try to get me to influence and talk about China on YouTube or something. And so like I always thought I was like this guy's a fucking spy. But the way he kind of told me is he's like imagine like um like Florida or something like that. If like we like you like Florida just kind of went and did its own thing and became its own thing, and you're just sitting there like what the fuck, and like we want them to be part of our country again. And he's like that's how we view it. And I was honestly sitting there thinking about it. I'm like I get it, but I'm on this side of like the
Yeah,
the aisle. I'm not a Chinese. I really don't give a shit what the Chinese think. And so for me, I'm like, I get where you're coming from, but I'm like, yeah, it still doesn't change what we got to do here.
and I mean
Yeah.
that's the basis of power. Like you can recognize what they think and be like, okay, that makes sense, but at the same time, you're like, I'm looking out for me and mine first and
Yes.
foremost.
So,
And
so real quick, you were talking about Russia. So I
mhm.
looked up their GDP per capita. Let me just share my screen.
Oh yeah, it's like
Um,
16,000, I think.
so I did GDP per capita, and then I did the purchasing power index. Oh, let me see.
At least it's not Pornhub.
Well, not that I know of. Let me see. Oh, shit, I'm gonna try to pull this up. So,
It's the most basic, like not like 2003 loading screen I've ever seen in my
well, dude,
life.
it's just Mac, and I'm just like I haven't fucking changed it. So Russia here,
Mhm.
47,000. Um, which I thought this was. I'll get to this in a second. But it's like, yeah, like you said, it's about Hungary, Romania, like those kind of like Eastern European countries that are like, it's about on that level.
Mhm.
Slovenia, Latvia, some of these places are lower. Um, but Poland, or I think it was Poland. Where's it at? Oh yeah, Poland was like right above it. Croatia, so there's like some of these countries here, Lithuania.
Is this GDP per capita purchasing power parity?
Yes.
Okay, good. I was about to say because when I said 16,000 earlier, I just meant straight GDP. So you did the PPP adjustment. So I'm proud of you
Yeah,
for
so I
that.
do the adjustments just because it's like, you never, because of this, exactly, this is what it is. So I was looking at list of countries by GDP, by purchasing power,
And
and
it's a
like
more
Russia's
accurate
four.
way.
And
And
so
for
like
the
Russia,
record, like
go
I
ahead.
just want to point this up. People a lot of times they go by the nominal.
No.
PPP is preferred by like economists and everything because like it we do nominal just by US dollars, so like that doesn't fully capture like things are cheaper in other countries. So like if you had $1 worth of goods, you could buy a lot more in Russia. So that means that's the whole purpose of the PPP adjustment. I just want to say I'm really proud of you for using that because that is the better metric.
Yes.
A lot of people don't know that, so I'm very proud of you for that.
Well, it's interesting because it's like Russia is four when you
Mhm.
really think about it. Now, I kind of disagree. I still think the United States, in terms of like GDP, I still think they're at the top, and I think, but just by regular GDP, I think they are.
Yeah,
But
nominal.
um, and that's where it's like, hey, yeah, this is a great tool, but it's like depending on what you're looking at, you kind of need to look at one or the other. But I think it's interesting to say, hey, look, like Russia is kind of they used to be a G8 country, right? So they
Mhm.
used to kind of be really in this group all the time. And so I think that's something that we also kind of don't think about a lot, where it's like Russia does economically have a lot of um, skills and usefulness and resources and like everything like that. Like they could really be an addition, which is why I always think about when you're talking about Putin trying to come over and uh, join the EU. I'm like, I know that'd be a good thing for Europe, and that's why I'm like, if just Russia could just kind of be a little bit more moderate on some of their stuff, they can really kind of, you know, probably pull Europe out of the shithole that they're in. because they're gonna have all the cheap resources and they might be able to kind of start spurring their economy again.
Well, to kind of take it back to like an America focus for real quick.
Yeah, go
So, so like
ahead.
Trump and them, Trump, Vance, all them, and like a lot of these picks for like Defense Department all been like, yeah, we need to come to like some sort of like a deal or agreement or something on like Ukraine and kind of we need to focus more on like Asia or whatever. Uh, the theory I've seen, and I've seen this from both like Russians, I've seen it both from like Chinese kind of outlets, I've seen it from like a lot of Americans I've talked to too, is like thick. And then, like I said, he's trying to get like G to come to his inauguration, stuff like that. So obviously, he's trying to cut some sort of deal. And the theory I'm seeing on a lot of this is like, hey, he's kind of got it in his mind if he can kind of cut a deal with the Russians, get them back on board in terms of just like stuff in general. Maybe we could make kind of like a deal to contain the Chinese, like flip them
Hmm.
from the Chinese camp to our camp. And before COVID, the Russians had been signaling they could be open to something like that. The
Well,
Japanese had.
that's what I heard is the biggest secret, or is the what's it called? It's like the unhidden secret, where it's like people are like Russia is in this weird position where people think they're allied to China, and to an extent they are, but it's more out of convenience than it is about any sort of ideological or political uh desire, Like they don't want to be with this is kind of like when Putin went to North Korea, like he didn't want to go to North Korea to be asking for help. You know what I mean? But it was like he kind of had to.
Yeah, I would say it's not necessarily convenience; it's more of necessity. Like it's like we
Maybe
didn't
that's
give
what it
them
was.
we didn't give them an opening to join us, and then obviously now that they're aggressively defending their interests, shall we say, like that's kind of put them in a position where it's like, okay, the only real people we can kind of ally with are the Chinese, and obviously the Chinese are like, this helps us because now if they get into a conflict with the U.S., well, hey, you've got access. Like obviously the U.S. Navy's going to try to cut their shipping lanes. So now you got an
Hmm.
alliance with Russia. You get all that Russian oil and natural gas. You don't have to worry about that. And so I mean, it's very and like this was a huge thing that like George Keenan had said back in the day. Take it back to him for a second, and there was a lot of people. There's this famous clip of Biden laughing about it, like, oh, from like the '90s. It's like, oh yeah, if Russia and China ally, whatever. And it's like, yeah, that was kind of the big thing in the Cold War. We really didn't want to happen. That's why Nixon went to China back in '72. That's why George Keenan was like, hey, we really don't need to be pushing these two nations together because Russian resources and technical expertise combined with Chinese technical expertise in industrial production and population, that's an entity that could really give us a run for our money. So it's like we really need to avoid that. And that was a big
So
thing that,
I was gonna say, so I've heard that the United States was the weakest during the Cold War when China and Russia were basically united against the United
yes,
States on an issue.
yeah,
During the
that,
50s during North Korea, like the United States, like we almost lost the Korean War. Like people
mm,
don't realize that. Like we like almost all of South Korea was taken. And when then they were getting material support, North Korea was from Russia and China, and then physical help from China. And so it's like when Vietnam, like there are times when they are united, the United States does not succeed geopolitically.
no, I mean, it's very basic sense. I mean, if you got this I mean, together they definitely outnumber some population, and then you add all those Russian resources and the Chinese industrial base. Yeah, like just talk about the Korean War real fast. So at that point, Stalin was still in power in the USSR. Mao was in power in China. They were extremely close, and that was when the Red Scare happened because it's like, well, like damn, like most of Eurasia is now under communists. In Korea, we fired I think it's three times as many artillery shells in just Korea, that one little area during that war with China, we fired three times as many artillery shells as we did in World War II.
Probably.
Fighting Japan, fighting Germany. No, I've got the statistics. Like we literally shot that much artillery. That's how bad that. Like people don't seem to get how like intense that conflict was. It's kind of the forgotten war at this point, and it really
Well,
shouldn't be.
especially when China got involved,
Oh
because
yeah,
what
like
people don't understand is people are like we ran out of bullets, and they just kept coming, and they were like we ran out of like especially those who were like way in like the cold mountains of North Korea. They're like we just shot, and like people just kept coming. And they're like, and it turns out it's like, oh yeah, there's like a million Chinese flooding down from the north, like the
Oh yeah,
fucking Rohan in Lord of the Rings. And it's like, holy shit, you know? And like we were just like, we just could not shoot enough of them.
yeah. I mean, another put that in context. Like literally, when that happened, that was like December of 1950. So, like to put it in perspective, like 5 years before, Japan had occupied most like a
Yeah,
fair chunk of China, and like China, the Chinese Civil War had literally just ended the year before. So, I mean, it wasn't like they were fresh. I mean, they were coming out of like very severe conflicts, and they still managed to do that. And like like there was entire units like of our military just got completely obliterated. Like they
yeah.
just overwhelmed them. And I mean, like
That's what I'm saying. There's a million of them. And
yeah,
we're
I mean,
like, yeah, we don't have that many guys.
it's like I don't think people get how like crazy that conflict was. I mean, they fought us to a draw. I mean, like neither side. I mean, like obviously North Korea failed to conquer South Korea, but we also failed to conquer North Korea. So
Yeah,
it was more or less a draw at the end. But yeah, I mean, like it's. I think you're seeing that now in terms of the point you made, where like when they're united, they're really hard to fight. Because I mean, to take it to like the most basic geopolitical level, are you familiar with the Heartland hypothesis? It's
I feel
pretty
like I
famous in
have.
geopolitics. You probably have. You're probably just not familiar with the name. So, real quick, It's considered one of the most basic geopolitical theories, and it's guided
I
more or
think I remember
less.
hearing about it, but it's been a while.
Yeah. So basically, the theory came out in like the late 1800s. I think it's from a guy named George McKinder. I can't remember if he was British or American. He may have been British, but I might be wrong on that. And his whole thing was like, like the center of Eurasia is like really critical to controlling Eurasia. So it's like if you can hold that, then you can hold Eurasia. If you can hold Eurasia, you can hold what he called the world island, which was be like Afro Eurasia, where it's all right there. So like his thing was like, okay, back then it was divided between the Russians, the Chinese, and that was the Russian Empire back in the day, and that was the Qing Dynasty, and then yada yada yada. So it wasn't like they were united. So it's a big thing going into World War One and World War Two, and as far as like geopolitical theories, like a big thing for the Germans was like, if things continue on, the Russians keep developing, they're going to swamp us, and like they're going to be the dominant Eurasian power. So that was the big thing with the Germans and the Russians fighting in both world wars, because it was kind of trying to determine that balance of power. And then the big thing with us, where we kind of came in after like after World War II, and the Soviets were going further, it was like, okay, the Russians now control, most of Eurasia, either directly or indirectly through the communist Chinese. So now it's like we really got to try to contain that. And then the whole thing with like Nixon going to China in the 70s was like, we need to drive a wedge between them or we're never going to win this. And then obviously, once we got that wedge between them, that did a lot to help us in the Cold War. And now,
Yeah.
50 years later, now it's the reverse situation. Still need to drive a wedge between them, but now it's like the theory of what Trump's trying to do with like all these signals. He obviously wants a deal in general with the Chinese, maybe a detente, but he's also trying to, the theory with what he's trying to do with like Ukraine is he might be trying to drive a wedge between Putin and Xi, and then kind of do in reverse what we did back in the 70s with Nixon. Instead of taking the Chinese away from the Russians, we're taking the Russians away from the Chinese. So that's kind of the theory I'm seeing right now, and the word I'm hearing is why they're signaling so hard on all this stuff. And it's definitely smart. I mean, if I was in his shoes, I would try something similar, because obviously, like, our issues with the Chinese kind of stem at this point. You can say it's democracy, you can say it's this or that, but ultimately, when it comes down to brass tacks, it's more or less like, out of all the nations in the world, the Chinese are the only ones that could plausibly displace us as being the dominant superpower.
Yep.
And I mean, at the end of the day, that if you've seen the movie Red Dawn, there's that famous scene where he's like, two toughest kids on the block, eventually they're going to fight. I think we're kind of at that point where it's like, we could manage the competition, we can try to do this or that, but at the end of the day, there's still going to be the underlying tension of they're trying to take our position, we don't want them to take our position. Insofar as the Russians, they're not in a position where they can plausibly displace us. I mean, that kind of went away with when the Soviets collapsed, but it's like, if you can tear them away from the Chinese, that helps our chances against the Chinese a lot. And it's like, going back to what I said earlier, it's like, realistically, even if Russia conquers all of Ukraine tomorrow, that's not really going to affect us all that much. It's not like we have I mean, obviously for the Europeans it'll suck because now they've got to deal with that. But it's like at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter to us. It's not going to affect us too awful much in a general sense, at least materially. So I think that's kind of part of the strategic thinking at this point in Washington, or at least as far as the Trump angle with it is like, if we could just get the Russians, back to where they were like 5, 6 years ago. And like I said earlier, I kind of started saying I think I went off on a tangent. There was some signaling in the late 2010s. Like the Japanese in particular, back then still had pretty decent relations with the Russians, and the South Koreans did too. And their kind of thing was like they were trying to use the Russians almost as kind of like leverage against the Chinese, like kind of not necessarily pit them against each other, but kind of like, hey, present a united front of like, hey, Russia and Japan, this is Russia and Japan, we're not really wanting you over in Beijing to do this or that. And obviously, once the whole Ukraine situation started, that whole angle went away. So it's not like the Russians aren't unwilling to do stuff like that, but it has to be, favorable on their terms. And
So,
insofar as like, go ahead, sorry.
oh, I was just gonna say. So it looks like we got 6 minutes and 30 seconds. You want me to add another one or not?
I think I'm gonna have to call it after this
Okay.
one.
So
So we'll do.
then let me wrap it up here. Of all of the countries, I guess, in the axis of evil, predominantly from Eurasia down to in that heartland down to China, who do you think is the first one to fall?
If I had to pick a country that I think out of that block that I think has a risk of like collapsing, I would definitely say Iran.
Okay.
Insofar as like the Eurasian bloc. Now, if you expanded it into like a global thing, there's very high signs the Trump administration is going to make an effort with Venezuela and Cuba. I mean, they're
Yeah.
going to go hard. They're going to go hardcore on that.
And I think that's kind of reasonable.
I do too. I think it's like I said earlier. Like every nation, like we consider the Americas our bloc. We've got these hostile actors there. Like, yeah, obviously we don't want that. So I mean, like I get that, but now the issue is where it's no longer just like it was back in the 2000s, where it's like each nation kind of on its own. It's now they've got a block they can turn to. Like, if we do start something, like obviously the Russians and the Chinese can start sending them arms, or they can do this or that. And like in Cuba now, that like after we talked about the other day, it came out like the Chinese now have at least I think it's like a battalion in Cuba,
Yeah, they're
which
sending missiles.
yeah, it's not a huge deployment yet, but I mean down the line that could be something. So I mean, but now if I had to absolutely had to pick a country I think could fall out of that, I would definitely say Venezuela or Iran.
So what?
Now,
Why? So now with Iran, how much of that is their domestic political or internal circumstances, and how much of it is external? And
I think
then
it's mostly
the follow up is where does Russia fall in that block to fall?
as far as like Iran, it's definitely its internal political situation. It's pretty it's very confusing, but yeah, I think it's mostly just their internal political situation is just an absolute mess.
Okay.
Insofar as like Russia, I don't think it's it's definitely like the second. Like, give me like where it ranks in the block. I mean, obviously it's number two.
So
It's only
you'd say
behind
after
China.
Iran, they'd be the next one to fall, or are you saying, in as far as position, they're number two?
Like as far as position, I don't think Russia or China are like in danger of like collapsing, and like I just don't see the signs there.
See,
Like,
I could kind of see it with Russia in that and it depends on where you hit it. I think if you start kind of having positive policies where you're bringing Russia in and
oh, what
maybe you
do you
can get
mean?
some reform and then Putin dies and you have a whole nother kind of internal power struggle, I could see where you could potentially position yourself to kind of getting them into your your favor, and I think that could happen within the next easily 10 years.
Oh, well, if you're
But
defining it as like they can kind of switch sides, then yeah, I could see that even happening under Putin if like Trump really tries for it. But it's like I thought you meant like in terms of like collapse, like a 1991 moment or something like that. I don't think
I
there's
mean,
any.
I think it could get there. But
I think
I think I don't know them. I think they are still too conservative politically, and I mean, there's still a lot of them who think like going back to the communist way is the way to go. You know what I mean? So like, I think you still have a lot of people that are kind of willing to sit back on like the good times, and I don't think that they are. you know, really going to want to challenge the political establishment.
I don't, and like the economic situation over there is so good right now in like relative terms to what it has been. Like they're having like the highest wage growth they've had in since like the 80s. I mean, they're having a war boom more or less, like kind of like how we
Hmm.
did after World War II. They're kind of having that. So I just don't see like insofar as like getting them collapse. I think it would take a lot of stuff that I just don't really foresee. I mean, like for one, it would probably take like an outright Ukrainian victory, like they take Crimea and everything back, maybe something like that, and then like some sort of economic crisis. But like, I don't know. I personally think, I mean, on the outlier margin, yeah, I could see something like that. But I just think in most probabilities, that just to be, at least in my view, I don't think that's a realistic probability.
So last thing, who of that axis worries you the most, and how do they fit into how this Russian European struggle is happening?
Without a doubt, China just has the economic. It has economic and military capabilities that like the Russians just don't have, and like China can definitely wield that economic influence in Europe. Like I said earlier, like Ukraine or not Ukraine, but like Hungary now has Chinese like investments, and a lot of these other countries are having Chinese investments, and like they're going to use that influence. I mean, there's no doubt. So I mean, like there is that, and so as insofar as like that axis, yeah, I definitely think China's like the bigger threat, and I think that's probably what the Trump's thinking. It's like China has the ability to potentially overthrow the U.S. led order. Russia really doesn't. Russia is a great power. It can establish its own zone of influence, but it's not really powerful enough. It's just, a do or die kind of threat to us. China is, and I think that's kind of why we're seeing the plays we're seeing.
All right, let's end it there.
All right.